The cinema of the Soviet Union, not to be confused with cinema of Russia, despite films in the Russian language being predominant in the body of works are described, includes films produced by the constituent republics of the Soviet Union reflecting elements of the pre-Soviet culture, language and history, albeit they were all regulated by the central government in Moscow. Most prolific in the Republican films, after the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, were Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, and, to a lesser degree, Lithuania, Byelorussia and Moldavia. At the same time, the nation's film industry, which was fully nationalized throughout most of the country's history, was guided by philosophies and laws propounded by the monopoly Soviet Communist Party, which introduced a new view on the cinema, socialist realism, which was different from the one before or after the existence of the Soviet Union. Historical outline. Upon the establishment of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic on November 7, 1917, what had formerly been the Russian Empire began quickly to come under the domination of a Soviet reorganization of all its institutions. For the outset, the leaders of this new state held that film would be the most ideal propaganda tool from the Soviet Union because of its widespread popularity among the established citizenry of the new land. Vladimir Lenin, in fact, reportedly even declared it the most important medium for educating the masses in the ways, means and successes of communism, a position which was later echoed by Joseph Stalin. However, between World War I and the Russian Revolution, the Russian film industry and the infrastructure needed to support it had deteriorated to the point of unworkability. The majority of cinemas had been in the corridor between Moscow and St. Petersburg, and most were out of commission. Additionally, many of the performers, producers, directors and other artists of pre-Soviet Russia had fled the country or were moving ahead of Red Army forces as they pushed further and further south into what remained of the Russian Empire. Furthermore, the new government did not have the funds to spare for an extensive reworking of the system of filmmaking. Thus, they initially opted for project approval and censorship guidelines while leaving what remained of the industry in private hands. As this amounted mostly to cinema houses, the first Soviet films consisted of recycled films of the Russian Empire and its imports, to the extent that these were not determined to be offensive to the new Soviet ideology. Ironically, the first new film released in Soviet Russia did not exactly fit this mold. This was Father Sergius, a religious film completed during the last weeks of the Russian Empire but not yet exhibited. It appeared on Soviet screens in 1918. Beyond this, the government was principally able to fund only short, educational films, the most famous of which were the agitki, propaganda films intended to agitate, or energize and enthuse, the masses to participate fully in approved Soviet activities, and deal effectively with those who remained in opposition to the new order. These short films were often simple visual aids and accompaniments to live lectures and speeches, and were carried from city to city, town to town, village to educate the entire countryside, even reaching areas where film had not been previously seen. Newsreels, as documentaries, were the other major form of earliest Soviet cinema. Dziga Vertov's newsreel series Kino Pravda, the best known of these, lasted from 1922 to 1925 and had a propagandistic bent. Vertov used the series to promote socialist realism but also to experiment with cinema. Still, in 1921, there was not one functioning cinema in Moscow until late in the year. Its rapid success, utilizing old Russian and imported feature films, jump-started the industry significantly, especially insofar as the government did not heavily or directly regulate what was shown, and by 1923 an additional 89 cinemas had opened. Despite extremely high taxation of ticket sales and film rentals, there was an incentive for individuals to begin making feature film product again. There were places to show the films, albeit they now had to conform the subject matter to a Soviet worldview. In this context, the directors and writers who were in support of the objectives of communism assumed quick dominance in the industry, as they were the ones who could most reliably and convincingly turn out films that would satisfy government senses. New talent joined the experienced remainder, and an artistic community assembled with the goal of defining Soviet film as something distinct and better from the output of decadent capitalism. The leaders of this community viewed it essential to this goal to be free to experiment with the entire nature of film, a position which would result in several well-known creative efforts but would also result in an unforeseen counter-reaction by the increasingly solidifying administrators of the government-controlled society. Sergei Eisenstein's battleship Potemkin was released to wide acclaim in 1925. The film was heavily fictionalized and also propagandistic, giving the party line about the virtues of the proletariat. One of the most popular films released in the 1930s was Circus. Immediately after the end of the Second World War, color movies such as The Stone Flower, Ballad of Siberia, and The Cuban Cossacks were released. Other notable films from the 1940s include Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Soviet cinema produced Ballad of a Soldier, which won the 1961 BAFTA Award for Best Film, and The Cranes Are Flying. Height is considered to be one of the best films of the 1950s. In the 1980s there was a diversification of subject matter. Touchy issues could now be discussed openly. The results were films like Repentance, which dealt with repression in Georgia, and the allegorical science fiction movie Kin DZA. Censorship. After the death of Stalin, Soviet filmmakers were given a freer hand to film what they believed audiences wanted to see in the film's characters and stories. The industry remained a part of the government, and any material that was found politically offensive or undesirable was either removed, edited, reshot, or shelved. The definition of socialist realism was liberalized to allow development of more human characters, but communism still had to remain uncriticized in its fundamentals. Additionally, the degree of relative artistic liberality was changed from administration to administration. Examples created by censorship include: the first chapter of the epic film Liberation was filmed 20 years after the subsequent 3 parts. The film's director, Yuri Ozerov, had refused to minimize the errors of the Soviet High Command during the first year of the war, and instead waited for a time when he could film this portion accurately. Sergei Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible Part 2 was completed in 1945 but was not released until 1958, 5 years after Stalin's death. Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky was censored before the German invasion of the Soviet Union due to its depiction of a strong Russian leader defying an invading army of German Teutonic Knights. After the invasion, the film was released for propaganda purposes to considerable critical acclaim. Revolution and Civil War. The first Soviet-Russian state film organization, the film's subdepartment of the People's Commissariat of Education, was established in 1917. The work of the nationalized motion picture studios was administered by the All-Russian Photography and Motion Picture Department, which was recognized in 1923 into Goskino, which in 1926 became Sovkino, the world's first state filmmaking school. The first state school of cinematography was established in Moscow in 1919. During the Russian Civil War, agitation trains and ships visited soldiers, workers, and peasants. Lectures, reports, and political meetings were accompanied by newsreels about events at the various fronts. 1920s. In the 1920s, the documentary film group headed by Vertov blazed the trail from the conventional newsreel to the image-centered publicistic film, which became the basis of the Soviet film documentary. Typical of the 1920s were the topical news serial Kino Pravda and the film Forward, Soviet, by Vertov, whose experiments and achievements in documentary films influenced the development of Russian and world cinematography. Other important films of the 1920s were Shub's historical revolutionary films such as The Fall of the Romanov Dynasty. The film Hydropete by Julia Buzhsky marked the beginning of popular science films. Feature-length agitation films in 1918 to 21 were important in the development of the film industry. Innovation in Russian filmmaking was expressed particularly in the work of Eisenstein. The battleship Potemkin was noteworthy for its innovative montage and metaphorical quality of its film language. It won world acclaim. Eisenstein developed concepts of the revolutionary epic in the film October. Also noteworthy was Pudovkin's adaptation of Gorky's Mother to the screen in 1926. Pudovkin developed themes of revolutionary history in the film, The End of St. Petersburg. Other noteworthy silent films were films dealing with contemporary life such as Barnett's The House on Trubna. The films of Protazina were devoted to the revolutionary struggle and the shaping of a new way of life, such as Don Diego and Pelagia. Ukrainian director Dovzhenko was noteworthy for the historical revolutionary epics of Anagora, The Arsenal and the poetic film Earth. 1930s. In the early 1930s, Russian filmmakers applied socialist realism to the work. Among the most outstanding films was Chapev, a film about Russian revolutionaries and society during the Revolution and Civil War. Revolutionary history was developed in films such as Golden Mountains by Sergei Yudkovich, The Outskirts by Boris Barnett, and the Maxim trilogy by Grigory Kozenziev and Leonid Trauberg. The Youth of Maxim, The Return of Maxim, and The Viborg Side. Also notable were biographical films about Vladimir Lenin such as Mikhail Roman's Lenin and In October and Lenin in 1918. The life of Russian society and everyday people were depicted in films such as Courageous 7 and City of Youth by Sergei Gerasimov. The comedies of Grigory Alexandrov such as Circus Volga and The Shining Path, as well as The Rich Bride by Ivan Pyayev and By the Bluest of Seas by Boris Barnett, focus on the psychology of the common person, enthusiasm for work and intolerance for remnants of the past. Many films focused on national heroes, including Alexander Nevsky by Sergei Eisenstein, Minanem Pozharsky by Vsevolod Pudovkin, and Bogdan Khmelnytsky by Igor Savchenko. There were adaptations of literary classics, particularly Mark Donskoy's trilogy of films about Maxim Gorky, The Childhood of Maxim Gorky, My Apprenticeship, and My Universities. During the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Stalin wing of the Communist Party consolidated its authority and set about transforming the Soviet Union, on both the economic and cultural fronts. The economy moved from the market-based new economic policy to a system of central planning. The new leadership declared a cultural revolution, in which the party would exercise control over cultural affairs, including artistic expression. Cinema existed at the intersection of art and economics, so it was destined to be thoroughly reorganized in this episode of economic and cultural transformation, to implement central planning in cinema. The new entity Soyuz Kino was created in 1930. All the hitherto autonomous studios and distribution networks that had grown up under NEP's market would now be coordinated in their activities by this planning agency. Soyuz Kino's authority also extended to the studios of the national republics such as VUFKU, which had enjoyed more independence during the 1920s. Soyuz Kino consisted of an extended bureaucracy of economic planners and policy specialists who were charged to formulate annual production plans for the studios and then to monitor the distribution and exhibition of finished films. With central planning came more centralized authority over creative decision-making. Script development became a long, torturous process under this bureaucratic system, with various committees reviewing drafts and calling for cuts or revisions. In the 1930s, censorship became more exacting with each passing year. Feature film projects would drag out for months or years and might be terminated at any point. Alexander Dovzhenko drew from Ukrainian folk culture in such films as Zemlya along the way because of the capricious decision of one or another censoring committee. This redundant oversight slowed down production and inhibited creativity. Although central planning was supposed to increase the film industry's productivity, production levels declined steadily through the 1930s. The industry was releasing over 100 features annually at the end of the NEP period, but that figure fell to 70 by 1932 and to 45 by 1934. It never again reached triple digits during the remainder of the Stalin era. Veteran directors experienced precipitous career declines under this system of control, whereas Eisenstein was able to make 4 features between 1924 and 1929. He completed only 1 film, Alexander Nevsky, during the entire decade of the 1930s. His planned adaptation of the Ivan Turgenev story Bezhan Lug was halted during production in 1937 and officially banned. One of many promising film projects that fell victim to an exacting censorship system. Meanwhile, the USSR cut off its film contacts with the West. It stopped importing films after 1931 out of concern that foreign films exposed audiences to capitalist ideology. The industry also freed itself from dependency on foreign technologies. During its industrialization effort of the early 1930s, the USSR finally built an array of factories to supply the film industry with the nation's own technical resources. To secure independence from the West, industry leaders mandated that the USSR develop its own sound technologies, rather than taking licenses on Western sound systems. 2 Soviet scientists, Alexander Shorin in Leningrad and Pavel Taja in Moscow, conducted research through the late 1920s on complementary sound systems which were ready for use by 1930. The implementation process, including the cost of refitting movie theaters, proved daunting, and the USSR did not complete the transition to sound until 1935. Nevertheless, several directors made innovative use of sound once the technology became available. In Enthusiasm, Symfonia Donbassa, his documentary on coal mining and heavy industry, Vertov based his soundtrack on an elegantly orchestrated array of industrial noises. In Desertir Pudovkin experimented with a form of sound counterpoint by exploiting tensions and ironic dissonances between sound elements and the image track. and in Alexander Nevsky. Eisenstein collaborated with the composer Sergei Prokofiev on an operatic film style that elegantly coordinated the musical score and the image track. As Soviet cinema made the transition to sound and central planning in the early 1930s, it was also put under a mandate to adopt a uniform film style, commonly identified as socialist realism. In 1932, the party leadership ordered the literary community to abandon the avant-garde practices of the 1920s and to embrace socialist realism, a literary style that, in practice, was actually close to 19th-century realism. The other arts, including cinema, were subsequently instructed to develop the aesthetic equivalent. For cinema, this meant adopting a film style that would be legible to a broad audience, thus avoiding a possible split between the avant-garde and mainstream cinema that was evident in the late 1920s. The director of Soyuz Kino and chief policy officer for the film industry, Boris Shumyatsky, who served from 1931 to 1938, was a harsh critic of the montage aesthetic. He championed a cinema for the millions, which would use clear, linear narration. Although American movies were no longer being imported in the 1930s, the Hollywood model of continuity editing was readily available, and it had a successful track record with Soviet movie audiences. Soviet socialist realism was built on this style, which assured tidy storytelling. Various guidelines were then added to the doctrine: positive heroes to act as role models for viewers, lessons in good citizenship for spectators to embrace, and support for reigning policy decisions of the Communist Party. Such aesthetic policies, enforced by the rigorous censorship apparatus of Soyuz Kino, resulted in a number of formulaic films. Apparently, they did succeed in sustaining a true cinema of the masses. The 1930s witnessed some stellar examples of popular cinema. The single most successful film of the decade, in terms of both official praise and genuine affection from the mass audience, was Chapayev, co-directed by Prokofiev and Grigory Vassiliev. Based on the life of a martyred Red Army commander, the film was touted as a model of socialist realism, in that Chapayev and his followers battled heroically for the revolutionary cause. The film also humanized the title character, giving him personal foibles, an ironic sense of humor, and a rough peasant charm. These qualities endeared him to the viewing public. Spectators reported seeing the film multiple times during its first run in 1934, and Chapayev was periodically re-released for subsequent generations of audiences. A genre that emerged in the 1930s to consistent popular acclaim was the musical comedy, and a master of that form was Grigory Alexandrov. He effected a creative partnership with his wife, the brilliant comic actress and chanteuse Lyubov Orlova, in a series of crowd-pleasing musicals. The pastoral comedy Volga Volga was surpassed only by Chapayev in terms of box office success. The fantasy element of the films, with lively musical numbers reviving the montage aesthetic, sometimes stretched the boundaries of socialist realism, but the genre could also allude to contemporary affairs. In Alexandrov's 1940 musical Svetly Orlova plays a humble servant girl who rises through the ranks of the Soviet industrial leadership after developing clever labor-saving work methods. Audiences could enjoy the film's comic turn on the Cinderella story while also learning about the value of efficiency in the workplace.